Volume 7 Scene 19. Ugh, maybe I should have stuck with Raymond. She rolled her eyes at her own impulsiveness, but when she looked back the way she'd come, she refused to turn around. No. I will see this through. I want to talk to him. I won't be talked over or talked down. Who are you kidding? You're being stubborn, she said to herself. In the far distance she could see a small village, impoverished prosperity, in a manner of speaking. Her effective eyesight let her see the distant crops, enough that she could be sure that even if they had very little, they had enough. She ran hard in that direction, her feet ate up ground like fire ate dry grass, and little by little the village grew larger in her eyes until she could see the heads of various people poking up amidst the fields of wheat, their bodies rising and falling in the endless rhythm of the farmer's dance. Her ears pricked up when she heard them singing, "That's a nice noise." She mused and slowed down to listen. "Oh, raise that hoe and bring it down. Harvest food to feed our town. Our kids grow up and we grow old. But farmers' tools they'll always hold. The gods look on and laugh all day, while I swing and swing away. 'Cause crops may stand and crops may grow, but not one stalk without my hoe." The depth of the voices indicated that they were mostly male, but there were a few women among them. She hummed the music. It was a contented, rollicking tune that set the rhythm of their actions and probably made the work go faster. It was hard not to like it, and Zesh's slow pace let her hear it go on and on until she was spotted heading toward the village and someone shouted, "Traveler!" For just an instant she thought it was a sense of alarm. Women rushed into houses, and children with them. What did I do? She wondered and pursed her lips into a tiny frown until she saw the women emerging again with a multitude of baskets, followed by young children carrying more of the same. They lined up by the road and began to wave at her with wild enthusiasm, their arms flapping faster than a hummingbird's wings as they tried to get Zesh's attention. Do they honestly think I don't see them? She wondered about that for a moment and then shook it off when she recalled what Senna once said to her about villages. Everybody there is a merchant when it comes to travelers. Some of them would sell their own kids for enough money. She counted that an exaggeration. Only elves do that kind of thing. It's why they have to be kept down. She recalled her answer to him, and the laughter that followed. The dark-haired captain was prone to laughter, and never took much very seriously. If it were up to him, we'd all just take naps, drink, and chew sweet bark all day. Though why he found her statement funny, she still didn't know. "I never did ask him what was so damn funny," she mumbled and recollected the mouth-watering flavor of the sweet bark he gave her right after he laughed, and just before he walked away. Great, now you want sweet bark. And Senna is on yet another one of his vacations, she mumbled to herself and resolved to see him as soon as she got back to Kami Miyako again. When she came closer, the peasants added words to the gestures. They wore decent enough clothing, simple laced-up shirts for young boys, single-piece dresses for women, and boots for all of them. "Hi, welcome to our village. Would you like to stay the night? I have an extra mat you can borrow?" An older woman asked. "I'll even throw in an evening and morning meal for 2 silvers. "Nonsense, I'm sure she just wants to move on, Miriam," a younger woman with chestnut hair said, "but I'm sure I don't see her carrying any supplies, so perhaps she'd like to buy some fresh fruits and vegetables. I can sell you some jerked meat, of course it'll be a good deal at 1 silver for a basketful." She held up a large woven basket packed with brightly colored fruits of various sizes, along with green, leafy vegetables, bright orange carrots, and long strands of yellow zest she didn't recognize. "I have no idea if those are good prices, but I do get the feeling I'm about to be robbed," she thought, and looked down when she felt a little tug on the long hair that hung behind her. She looked down to see a small boy and girl with bright grins on their faces holding up a pitcher of water in both hands. When she looked inside she saw various cut lemons floating around. "Buy some lemon help water," the pair shouted in sync. "I'm afraid I don't have money," she said. "I'm looking for someone though. Did a man with blue hair and a katana pass through here?" When she asked, the little sea of happy faces became crestfallen. "No. Nobody like that. You're the first visitor in days." But an old woman was speaking, and then fell silent. The wind picked up, and she felt it flow over her face and lift up strands of hair enough that it exposed the half-elven ears she otherwise concealed. "Mongrel!" the old woman hissed, "get out." As soon as the word was hissed, the mood soured, the faces went from crestfallen to hateful. "Mongrel! Mongrel? "Aim from here, Zess," she said. Her black and white eyes blinked back the dismay she felt at their sudden hostility. "Mongrels be mongrels no matter where they be from," the chestnut-haired young woman said and spat in the dirt at Zesh's feet. "Beat it, we don't want your kind around here." "But the one I am looking for." Zesh looked around at those who glared back at her, not one friendly face in the little crowd. The old woman who offered a place to stay was the only one who didn't look hateful. Instead she was only relieved, and Zesh made to finish her sentence directed toward her instead. When the old woman saw Zesh's face center on her, she screeched and spittle flew from her wrinkled lips out of her toothless mouth. "Thanks be to the gods I didn't dirty my mat with mongrel touch. I'd never be able to rent it out again. Get out before we drown you like your father should have." Zesh feared none of them, even bare-handed. Killing them would have been easy. "I'm a soldier, I help defend this country. How dare you speak to me this way?" Zesh snapped at them and cracked her knuckles. "Go away," the little ones with their lemon water shouted, then tipped over the jug they carried and dumped it against Zesh's leg. The cool liquid had a faintly acidic smell to it, and Zesh raised her hand overhead. "Little rotten bastard," she snapped. "It's violent. Call the watch on it." One of the women screamed, and Zesh lowered her hand to back away. "If I go too far." The lessons imbued within her from the earliest years of her life, to be careful not to harm weaker people around her, stayed her hand. She backed away again, then turned and ran. "At least he didn't come this way. I'll go try a different road." But what was wrong with those people? What even is a mongrel supposed to be? She wondered before mumbling under her breath, "Zesh, you have got to get out more." The Elf King gored the woman underneath him, rutting like a bull in heat, his supremely powerful fists held around her throat, threatening to snap her neck if she relaxed herself even a little. She didn't move, only laying there and waiting until he was finished. It did not take long, it never did, for the cruelest of kings. It wasn't a matter of pleasure, though he took that as he could, but about creating strong children. Something his people did very little of. Get out and go try to make something worthwhile," he snapped and got up. Being encamped on theocracy territory wasn't something he worried much about. The chance of being caught was minimal. The chance of being caught by something that was a threat, he dubbed impossible. His golden tent, much like the golden hair that tumbled sweaty and loose down his back, stood out. Founding that worthless kingdom was a waste of time for so long. The only real success was from that human female. "If I can find more like that one at the tournament, I won't even need these worthless servants any longer." That last thought was at least partially a lie. Any king needed servants, but the world was a big place. "I can always replace them." He shrugged off the thought and waited while the husband of his last plaything brought the king's preferred green robe. The cloak keeper stood on a stool while the king put out his arms. With a grunt of effort, the cloak keeper stretched out on his tiptoes and slipped the sleeve over his lord's left arm, then did the same with the right. Tears blurred his eyes as he listened to his wife's feet withdrawing to their quarters. The humiliation of attending the one to abuse his wife was at least a familiar one, and one in which he had expansive company. Serve or die. Some days, the latter would be better. It was an old thought, but rarely followed up on by the elven population, which remained hopeful that one day someone might rise to bring down their tyrant. "Have the cook prepare me something that isn't trash, and send me his wife while he's cooking," the Elf King commanded. His cruel, piercing blue and purple heterochromatic eyes at least couldn't be seen from the back. The cloak keeper went to the lord's front and reached up to his waist to begin binding the robe shut. "As you will it. But, may this humble one beg a question?" the cloak keeper asked. "This is it. This might be the end for me." The fist of the king did not descend to splatter his head. This was the safest time to ask him anything, just after he'd finished using someone, and the nature of the situation was odd enough that curiosity replaced hostility for just a moment. "What?" he asked, and the cloak keeper kept his head lowered while he bound the royal knot of the robe. "Your Majesty has always wanted strong children, and we have all heard your will about the tournament, but we wonder why you fear to begin on the journey there?" The cloak keeper shivered, but again the heavy fist did not splatter his head. "Who says I fear?" the Elf King said with quiet wrath. "None," he answered, which was true at least, "but we note that you avoid the many humans along the way, and instead prefer the safety of those who have already failed you in their worthlessness." In any other circumstances, the Elf King considered, I would crush his brain in his skull, But now? He has a point. Stealth doesn't suit me, and there are many chances along the way. Why waste time with their wives when there are so many I haven't tested yet? Why should I wait to take that empire as my prize? The thought set his loins to stirring. Forget the chef and his wife, we're moving out tonight. There is a village only a few miles ahead, yes? We will go there and I will find out if the successful brat's mother was a fluke or not. As your majesty commands, the cloak keeper said, stepping back. He bowed and stared down at the ground, his eyes trembling around the edges while suppressing the mad laughter over his successful manipulation of the cruel king. We are spared. Our wives are spared. Let the humans pay the price, they deserve nothing less. He told himself, though that did not completely rid himself of the twinge of guilt he felt when he thought of what their lord would do all the way north to our winter, to all manner of unsuspecting peasants. He then straightened himself when he had his face under control, and backed out of the tent until the flap closed in front of him again. The king wants us to head to the nearest human village. He has chosen other targets for himself. The guards who stood outside the tent holding their bows at the ready looked at the cloak keeper with brief awe. You? He cut the question off. I did. Our wives are safe for now. Those of humans? He shrugged. Let them deal with him. The cloak keeper answered, and the two elven warriors almost fell forward as they embraced the servant. Their tears of happiness stained their cheeks and his own as they held one another fast in their unexpected sense of relief. Hurry and get ready. I have to go and comfort my wife, the cloak keeper said, and hastened away to follow the sound of quiet weeping. Volume 7 C20. Ein sat at the table. It was far from the most luxuriant of things. Even at a guess it was only slightly more expensive than what a modestly successful merchant could afford. Though it had a smooth shining polish, it was unadorned by precious metals or artistic designs. Flatly put, it was nice but only one jump up from common, unique and noble only in that it was long enough to host the whole assembly. The same went for all the furnishings. The chairs were polished and cushioned, but devoid of unique artistry. The tapestries were locally made, and a somewhat crude representation of peasants learning new skills rather than masters at work. There was, however, one thing which set the hall of the Wolf King and Wolf Queen apart. On the far end of the hall there was a crackling fire, and, up above, many windows allowing the room to be flooded with light during the day. Along the wall, as the evening was settled, there lay many candles which bathed the room in a dancing shadow, casting an orange glow. The smell of roasting meat wafted into the room from where it was being prepared, almost as though one's own mother was preparing the evening meal only a few paces away. That was the spirit of the hall of the kingdom of Kani. Home. The whole feel of the place was one of familial intimacy, and, at the head of the table, the Wolf Queen and her husband rose to their feet. Their cups held aloft to the sea of guests. Henry's smile was a glowing warmth, given to each one who sat near or far from the head. Heinz couldn't help but think it was as if his own mother were about to toast him. To a short fight, a long peace, and all our bright futures, she said it simply. It was no elegant speech. But while she said less than a great orator might have, she meant it more. And so when the rest of the table echoed, to a long peace and bright future, it was hard for the most cynical of lords or ladies to not mean it, at least in that moment. If this is the tenure of their rule, they will be popular monarchs, and not just here. Heinz made a mental note, and settled in to enjoy both the meal, and the next few days while the other leaders arrived to journey onward to our winter as one. The long journey carried the delegation of the Holy Queen and the Frost Queen over fine rolling countryside, through peasant towns, and to small castles. Their stops along the way remained amiable, and between the two along the way, the Dragonid and the human sought to resolve 1,000 petty disputes of trade goods and the flow of travel. Sometimes they were successful, at others the pair could not quite agree. It was during one such evening that they returned to a commonly broached subject from their letters, but not asked in person until the present in the country home of the Riastais royal family. "How are my humans doing in your kingdom?" Queen Kalkar asked. "Well enough," Naya answered, her tail dancing at her back. "I have had some trouble with a particularly tenacious poacher not far from my capital whom we suspect is human. But that should settle down once I've made it my private reserve and bought the area from the ones who own the land now. Other than that, they do fine. The land is good for farming and their produce under Duke Astraka is feeding a great many people. I suppose it helps that they have a human lord," Kalka said with a twinge of frustration when she looked away from her counterpart. Naya sat back in the chair and reached for her goblet. Bigotry is a problem on both sides of the border. As Kalka's words were as close as she could come to a true apology, so too were Naya's as close as she could come to conciliation. It's almost enough to make a common enemy desirable, to help erase the past. The Holy Queen remarked and reached for her own goblet while her son fussed a little in her other arm. Naya said nothing, not right away. When she spoke it was with quiet iron in her voice. That may sound nice, but there lies the difference between you and I, Holy Queen. You spent your life in the palace far removed from the common soldier. I was a common soldier. War is work, ugly work filled with filth and fear. A thing like what you say is the stuff of nightmares. May its horror never come. Kalka looked away, chastened, down at her son who fussed briefly, then she drained her cup in a gulp and brought her infant to the breast to feed him and said, I did say almost. That you did, Naya said and finished her cup with a brief swig to pair with her concession. Almost what? Queen Rena asked when she entered the room, prompting the pair of royal guests to rise to their feet to greet their host. Zesh's sprint went down to a jog, not for want of energy or strength, but because for the first time in her life she could actually enjoy the sheer size of the wider world. Within mere hours of her departure, she repeated herself. You have got to get out more, Zesh. But what she once said with irony, she now said with conviction. The wind and the trees, the grass of the fields and the babbling of the river called to her. And when she passed through a clutch of trees, pausing to take from some of the hanging fruits, their wide trunks and high boughs called to her. My elven side asserting itself. She realized, and clamped down on it with loathing that roiled in her gut. Without thinking about it, she slowed to a walk and reached up to change her hair, ensuring that her ears were covered. If only she'd let me cut them off. Zesh, she thought, recalling her childhood. I was just trying to cut the rapist parts off. Her answer to her mother had earned her more hugs than swats when the one-time guardian of humanity yanked away the knife from her daughter's hands. She recalled vividly the frantic way the valorous woman ran her hands over Zesh's in the wash basin, removing the red blood from every tiny finger. The trembling, shaking hands of a dedicated parent lived long in Zesh's mind. I haven't thought of that in years. The half-elf realized and tried to put it from her mind as she drew closer to the distant town. Maybe he's here. Maybe not. Either way, at least I can say Raymond is probably worried. Zesh's brief reflection on her traveling companion troubled her to no end. To him at least, I can say sorry. But I have to know, and he's hiding something. Zesh's certainty was coupled with a dark distaste that came out in the way she clenched her fist as the town loomed closer. The walls were pathetic, and the guards even worse than the walls. But as it wasn't an enemy position and the gate was now open, she walked right up to it just as a young couple set out. They wore bright, cheerful smiles and waved to her with enthusiasm. He had a rough, peasant beard that wasn't quite well trimmed for want of a mirror. She wore a simple single-piece dress that flapped a bit in the breeze, and both carried polished walking sticks worn smooth by time, and packs on their backs with patchy bedrolls up at shoulder level. "Excuse me, have you seen a blue-haired swordsman with a sword come through here today?" They stopped to look the odd figure of Zesh up and down, and briefly traded a look with one another as only married couples could, asking without speaking. "Nah, sorry lady, haven't seen anyone like that, but if he's smart he'll be leaving here same as us, so you probably going the wrong way," the taller male uttered with a brief shudder. Why?" Zesh asked and looked away from him and toward the town, a bit dirty and crude. It was no Kami Miyako, but there was no obvious danger to prompt their eagerness to leave, nor did she see signs of fear on the pair. "The Kingdom of Kani, miss, ain't you heard of it? They let in non-humans settle in there, and I don't mean as like living tools, I mean like," he shivered, "people. So we sold everything and we're going south. The border's just a hop, skip, and a jump away, goblin neighbors. Can you imagine? Course there's others, but lot of goblins there I hear. People go up there to trade, come back with all kinda stories. None of them good, so we travel in south to be safe. Lot of us are. Anyway, hope you find your friend, miss, but like I say, he's smart, he's going south where it's safe." "Right." Zesh suppressed her frown, but before she could say anything else another voice carried down to her. "Hey. Somebody ask about the blue-haired guy?" It was a gruff voice, but a little dubious. Zesh stepped away from the couple, who took that as their cue to leave, and then she craned her neck to look up at a spear-bearing guard. "Yes, you know him?" "Nah, don't know him, but I know of him. Not many folk have blue hair, and even fewer carry just one sword and no shield. Might odd he was, traveled with his daughter." He asked about where to stay. "If that's your man, he went for the inn that away." The guard leveled his spear toward a side street, and Zeshi nodded. "Thanks," she said, but the answer sounded wrong. He wasn't traveling with a child. Couldn't be. But then, the guard up there has a point, not many people look like that. Zeshi thought it over for a moment. I guess it can't hurt to look, she resolved, and with a confident and hopeful spring in her step she made her way in the direction the guard indicated. Her feet slogged through no small amount of nasty muck. The smell of horse manure tainted the air and blended with the smell of unwashed bodies. The noise of squelching feet coupled with the babble of humans going about their business created a cacophony of noise that was equal parts unfamiliar and unpleasant to the long-isolated Zeshi. Her nose crinkled a little as she suppressed the urge to gag before entering the establishment that was marked as an inn. "You know that thing you said you should do?" she asked herself. "Get out more?" she answered her own thought. "Yes, if most of the world smells like this, forget it," she answered herself again. Agreed. Zeshi agreed with herself and then approached a large, obese-looking man who slid a wooden mug across a long smooth wooden bar and directly into the waiting hand of a patron. He looked up when the bell above the door rang. "What can I do you for, miss?" He wore a gap-toothed smile and had a grandfatherly manner about him that reminded her of an older Raymond. It was enough to bring a little smile to her face when she said, "I'm looking for a friend of mine. Blue hair, curved sword, fit-looking man, know him?" she asked. "Brain, sure do. He's staying here but I'm afraid he's not in just now," the old man answered, and Zeshi brightened up. "Oh, do you know when he'll be back?" she inquired, and the old man shrugged. "Nah, hard to say. He went out after a group of bandits, trying to get some money for some things, you know, travelin' needs." The old man clammed up just a little. It was a subtle thing. His smile went a little smaller and his words more hasty. He also ignored or didn't hear someone slapping the bar demanding another drink. "Vantaron ain't an easy line of work. It'll pay all right, so he went out to make some quick coin. I can leave a message for him for you. Give it to him when he gets back, if and you like," the old man offered, and his smile brightened again, though it hesitated to spread out as far as it previously had. "Can I wait in his room? I really need to see him, or wait here?" she asked. "Nope. 'Fraid I can't have people loiterin' about not buyin' nothin', and I ain't got no rooms anyway." He added the last part with such haste that even knowing she was inexperienced, it felt like a lie. "I see. Okay then, just tell him he had a visitor and ask him to wait for me down here," Zeshi said, and the old man's eyes never left her as she removed herself from the building. He didn't mention the daughter. What's going on here? Zeshi felt the same sense she had with Raymond, that something was being concealed, hidden away. Her senses tingled as if she were about to enter a fight, and she closed the door gently behind her. For once Zeshi felt a measure of gratitude for her elven senses and began to walk around the side of the building. The lower half was clearly a tavern, but that obviously meant that the rooms were on the upper floor. The sinking squelch of her boots would have given her away had it been the middle of the night, but as it was, nobody thought anything of the noise of one person just walking around minding their own business. "Ugh, my hair. It's probably a mess at the bottom now. Great, one more thing to dislike here." She cursed and tilted her head up to search out the smell. While no bloodhound, her senses wouldn't miss him if he were concentrated somewhere. It took some walking around, but then there it was, an open window and the leftover smell of her brief dinner guest. Zeshi looked to her left and right. People were passing by, but nobody was watching, nobody was listening. So she jumped. Her powerful legs sent her rocketing up to the second floor, and with one brief pull at the windowsill, she hauled herself inside. Rolling once over the floor, she came to her feet with a little bounce. There, lying on the bed, was a young girl, obviously a half-elf. She lay on top of his cloak, holding it tight against her body, and lost her grip the moment she saw the intruder. For one brief moment Layali and Zeshi's collective three eyes were frozen and locked on one another, and then Layali opened her mouth to scream. Volume 7 C21. Layali felt her entire body go stiff, her lips parted. "Nobody good ever sneaks in through a window? Who is this?" Is this a slave catcher? Did Master Cerebrate send a slave catcher after me? No. I won't go back. I won't. The scream remained locked in her head and she flung herself off of the bed. While she didn't have a knife, she had a spoon. She began weeping out of her good eye and jabbed the handle side of the spoon toward her empty eye socket. If I can just hit the brain, it'll be over quick. No more pain. No more Cerebrate. I guess I'll never know if Brain kills him or not. I'll just have to hope. All those thoughts ran through Layali's mind in the time it took to draw the end of the spoon toward her eye socket, while her good eye squeezed shut against the pain to come and also closed off her view of the white and black-haired intruder. Which is why it was a shock when she felt a hand on her wrist. It closed around her with relative gentleness, but it was as immovable as any mountain. Layali had no more will to scream, instead she only tugged and pulled. No. I won't go back. I don't want to live if I have to go back. Please. Please don't take me back. She whimpered, pleaded, and pulled herself wildly about before she thought to stab herself in reverse. She slowed as if she were running out of breath. The woman, for that much she was sure her captor was at least, still hadn't said anything, and so the little half-elf girl relaxed. She looked up at the woman, met the heterochromatic eyes with her one good one and said, I'm not going back. She then slammed her head forward. If I caught her off her guard. Layali didn't get to finish the thought. Faster than should have been possible in her experience, the woman's other hand came up and caught Layali at the hair, keeping her from the coup de grace. That finished the last of her will. Layali felt the hopelessness of her efforts. Her knees went weak, her final strength fled. For God's sake, don't do this. Human scum. Seen you all pity dogs. At least put me down too. She whimpered out and trailed off with one final plea, please. Slave catcher. Don't take me back to my master. She smelled the thick salve on the girl's flesh as much as she smelled the fear on the little wounded creature. The half-elven extra seat of the black scripture knew the smell of fear like bees knew the smell of flowers. She also knew the smell of blood, and the signs of injury, and this one. She has a lot of them. And a slave catcher? What even is that? Why would a slave ever run away from? No, look at her. Stupid. She didn't do this to herself. She concluded that quickly enough and crouched down. Be quiet. The older half-elf said to the younger, I'm like you, she whispered, and that, if it didn't stop the girl's cries, at least kept back any chance she would scream and ended the struggles. Like me? Layali's doubts rose, but she dropped the spoon which clattered to the floor a second later. She brought the girl's hand over to the white hair and brushed it aside, revealing Zesh's own half-elven ear. Layali gasped, her breath heavy as it wafted over Zesh's face and smelling of stew. Who are you? I'm looking for someone who was in this room. I suppose he did this to you? Zesh asked. Strange, I didn't get the feeling he was that sort, but, who knows, maybe you never can really tell. She wondered privately. Before Layali could answer, the little click of the door being opened reached both half-elves and caused their ears to prick up. Gouging out a child's eye is. May, I've put down real monsters for less. She whirled on the door and before Layali could say or even properly think, Brain was entering the room. I'm back. I've got a Brain had no time to react. The fist that came for him was loaded with killing intent. And yet for all that, he sensed one thing for sure, if she meant to kill him, it would have been faster. It was meant to cause him pain. But that relative ease had nothing on him. He dropped beneath it, dropped a satchel in hand down to the floor and drew his sword all in one motion. There was no time to use martial arts, not for either of them, and while Brain was armed he could see the invader was not, and yet it didn't seem to matter. His sword flashed out leagues faster than he felt it ever had. Layali, make a run for it, he hissed out the words as fast as he moved his sword. I'm not going to win. He realized. Her hands casually deflected his sword as if they were unbreakable adamantite. Your sword is worthless again. You were so proud. So damn proud. You wanted to try in the tournament, what a joke. He recognized the half-elf woman, and between mocking his futile efforts he wondered, why is she after me? Or Layali? Slave catcher. I've heard they use half-elves for that. Never seen one. Must have been looking for this one. Cerebrate could certainly afford it. Brain cursed his ill luck and watched the woman deflect his best efforts without even bothering to strike him down, and worse, she kept herself between Brain and Layali. Like she was taunting him. The small half-elf was frozen, unmoving, paralyzed, the way she was when she first met him. Poor thing. Poor thing. The blinking of the one good eye and hollow brutality he found in her ruined frame could have moved a stone to pity, how much more so a living man. And in that moment Brain's feet went faster, rather than carrying him away in flight. His sword carried in arcs that the woman in front of him still deflected, and yet it felt as if he were climbing to the peak he'd longed for since the age of 12. One quick look at the top before she kills me, he vowed and began to mutter martial arts under his breath. Not bad. He's an adventurer through and through, that much was so at least, but he's still trying to get at the girl more than he is trying to kill me? It was a curiosity to Zeshi, and she chose not to activate any martial arts of her own. He's on par with a windflower scripture, or maybe a sunlight scripture. No, he's on par with Clementine at least. Zeshi pondered and allowed him to drive her back. His foot nudged the satchel he dropped before, and out of it rolled a little blue potion. The noise of the thick glass caught Layali's ears, and looked down to see that it bumped against her foot. Stop, she cried all of a sudden, snapping out of her fear and silence-induced confusion. Blade and open hand stopped cold. Layali crouched down and picked up the potion. I've seen these. The humans, they used this on their own kind. He really brought me one? She felt a tear escape her eye and clutched it to her chest. It wasn't Mr. Brain who did this to me. Please. If you're like me, don't hurt him, Layali said and put a hand on the hip of the half-elf. Zeshi cast a doubtful eye down on her. It was Master Cerebrate, Layali whispered and retold the story while nervous fingers fumbled at the little brown cork on the potion. When Layali got up to the part where Brain had helped her days before, Zeshi's hands lowered slowly to her sides, and Brain sheathed his sword. So you're not a slave catcher? Brain asked. No, of course not. Zeshi frowned. Why would you even think that? I've met Cerebrate, for one, and for another, it's pretty common to use half-elves for it. Nobody cares if they die, they get better at it over a long period of time, and you can hold their parents or children hostage to ensure their good behavior. Plus, elf or human, there's always somebody at the bottom who would sell out their own blood for the price of a honey cake, or a little power over the rest. It's kind of common to use the half-breed sons of slave mothers to chase after their own kind. The theocracy is a practical sort of place. Zeshi's frown deepened. What are you even doing here? Brain demanded as he crossed the space between them both and took the potion from Layali's nervous fingers and popped the cork before handing it back. He crouched down. Drink it all, he said to her, and she gave a little quiet nod before bringing the vial to her lips. Where's your escort? Brain asked, and Zeshi crossed her arms in front of her chest. Somewhere behind me, or ahead of me, I don't know. Raymond will find me sooner or later. I'm not worried about it. I'm here to talk to you, something you said, and given what else you've just said. I'm not a complete idiot, but I'll ask anyway. Why did you assume my father was a human? You chased me for days on end over the gods know how many miles just to ask me that? Brain asked, aghast, and sat with a heavy thud into the nearest chair. Answer me, Zeshi hissed her demand, and Brain cocked his head when he looked at her as if the half-elf were some alien creature from a far-off land. Ask her, Brain said and pointed to Layali whose body was straightening as the magic began to take effect. Zeshi looked down at the girl, and this time Layali didn't hesitate to speak. Because it's what happens in this nightmare country, Layali spat back, and Zeshi, having seen the brutal wounds on the girl, found no way to question it. She felt as if the ground fell out from beneath her feet, and all she knew began to fall with it. Queen Bessarace, Queen Baraha, I'm so glad you've made it to my estate, Rena said with a demure curtsy. Queen Vaself, it was good of you to host us, Kalka said with a curtsy of her own. Naya inclined her head and gave a little half-bow, as am I, thank you. I've heard quite a bit about you and your rule from the few travelers who have ventured over into my domain. There was the slightest hint of critique in Naya's words, nor were they wrong as few merchants proved willing to cross the coastal border even for the sake of profit, fearing some harm would come to them. Rena accepted the criticism with the most courteous of little smiles. I'm sure you will hear a great deal more as my merchants become more bold and we look to expand our commercial enterprises. For example, I'm considering a national trading company intended expressly to serve the Crown's needs. Something that will ease our dependence on private merchants and hopefully lower the price of goods. A source of such supplies right over the border would be a welcome one. The effect on the Frost Queen was immediate. Naya's general lack of subtlety compared to the more experienced monarchs made it impossible for the Dragonid to completely disguise her response. The whites of her eyes expanded, and her fang-filled smile grew just a little with them. Mostly, however, the concept Rena laid out caught the Demalbian Queen's ears. That would be a good idea. I've been reliant on the scant trade and expensive services of the Understone Empire, but those dark dwarves just don't need much. And the Dark Elves don't produce much but raw materials. The slain theocracy shut their border and very few are still willing to go to the Southern Holy Kingdom. A national company could go a long way towards supplementing my budget. She felt her headache a little and resolved immediately, I'll delegate it to Astrika. The headache began to fade and the Frost Queen relaxed. You have a lovely estate. She offered the praise with rather more warmth than before, and Queen Vaself claimed a seat, which in turn allowed her guests to reclaim their seats as well. Thank you, it belonged to my late elder brother, Prince Barbaro. He was a mean, nasty boy and he became a corrupt, nasty man, but at least he had good taste, Rena said and held up an empty cup that sat on the table as if it had been just waiting for her arrival. Seemingly out of nowhere a servant approached bearing a bottle and poured it for her. Still, he was your brother, and that is not an easy loss. I'm sorry. I have no siblings, but if losing friends is hard, losing family is worse. Naya suggested, and both Kalka and Rena had to suppress the urge to raise their eyebrows. Naya had enough wit about her to recognize their silence for what it was. I was a soldier who got lucky. I'm not born to the purple, so excuse me if I don't have the most queenly demeanor about some things. She bowed her head and when a cup was poured and slid toward her, she took it and waited until Kalka's was similarly prepared. Perhaps a little frankness is what we all need, Kalka suggested. Rena cleared her throat a little and pressed the matter at hand. About tomorrow, now that we're all gathered, according to the schedule we'll be leaving after breakfast and going toward Kani to meet with the Wolf Queen, Wolf King, Queen Draudillan, and the Allfather. From there we travel in a long procession to our winter to observe the proceedings and watch the tournament unfold. So nothing has changed. That's good. It means everything is going well. Between all of our escorts, this will be the safest traveling experience in history, Kalka said, and then cocked her head when the Queen of Frost laughed. Naya waved her taloned hand back and forth as the laughter rang beyond her ability to suppress it. Forgive me, Naya said, it's just that in my old life we'd have said you were going to trigger a flag with a statement like that. It's nothing, I'm sure we'll be fine, but I do wonder what they'll say about all this when it's over. After all, when in all history have so many monarchs traveled together for anything other than war? That jerked both of her counterparts back to their youthful lessons in history, and vainly they sought for an example, until they gave up. You make a fair point, perhaps this really is the beginning of something remarkable for the peace of the 11 realms. Queen Rena acknowledged and began to re-evaluate her initial appraisal of the Dragonoid Queen. She has the subtlety of a mace, the manners of a common soldier, and the look of a predator. But at least she sees farther than the nose on her face. I can work with this, she told herself and raised her cup in a toast. To lasting peace, Rena proclaimed. And prosperity with it. Naya added a section of her own. For us and the next generation. The new mother could not help herself, and added something of her own. They drank deeply of the rich dark wine after that, several times, before it was time to rest for the next day's journey. Volume 7 C22. She could not remember having ever been knocked down. Not by anyone. But the little half-elf child's words were a heavier blow than that of any monster. And like anyone caught in a desperate circumstance, her first response was to deny it. You're lying. You've got to be. She accused. Her heterochromatic eyes glared daggers at the girl until she moved behind Brain and hid from Zesh's view. Why would you even suspect that? Brain demanded, crossing his arms in front of his chest. Your father was human, wasn't he? Zesh stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. No, he wasn't, was he? Brain guessed. His mind raced while the silent half-elf girl stared at him, watching him come to the only feasible conclusion. I've heard stories about the Elf King. You're one of his children, aren't you? The first half-elf he made. Zesh answered, humans rescued my mother. Humans protected and raised me. Humans promised me revenge. Elves. Brain interjected, are just like you. I've traveled almost everywhere, and that includes the elf kingdom. I went anywhere there was somebody I can learn from, and let me tell you something. Elves are his victims too. Brain felt the young half-elf put her hands on the back of his shirt, her little hands balling up into fists. Explain the girl, Zess, she said. It was a pointless diversion of a demand, but she couldn't help herself. Driftwood? Brain said, and Zess, she looked, for a moment, very confused. She scratched her head, and only when she saw the girl poke him in the side with her finger did he elaborate. I found her in the river some time after we parted ways. Brain explained. Layali, come out, she's not a slave catcher. If she were, we wouldn't be talking. Besides, anyone that could wouldn't be hunting slaves. Zess, she accepted the praise with a polite nod as the girl moved beside the human again. Thank you. While you weren't a challenge for me, you're one of the strongest opponents I've ever faced. On par with Clementine, a former member of our strongest scripture, or better. Brain's rugged face wasn't one to blush, but he did sigh with relief. All I want is the peak. Looking at it now, knowing how far away it is, had you not said that, I'll be honest, the gap between us would have broken me. I'll rest easier for your praise. He looked down at the girl. Layali, why don't you tell her? She's dangerous, scary. Do I? Layali began to ask, and to her surprise, Brain crouched down to her level and said, she's ignorant. Somehow, tell her how you ended up traveling with me, and start at the beginning. The half-elf's newly restored pair of eyes grew wide as she understood the emphasis of his words. The beginning. Everything. She blinked both of her eyes as she understood what was being asked of her, but there the woman stood, waiting. A half-elf like herself but worlds apart lay between the two. If she doesn't believe me, what if she turns on us again? Brain can't beat her. This is our only chance. I'll make her believe me. That's our only chance to come out of this alive. The look in the large human's eyes was hopeful, encouraging, unblinking. It'll be all right, he said to her, and resolve steeled in her heart. She looked at the well-dressed woman in her fine travel clothes, and it was hard not to feel disgust for her ignorance as much as for her evident wealth. I was born on a farm, I think, about 90 years ago. My father was my mother's owner. Layali began her story, and Zess, she sat down to listen. I saw the children my father had with his human wife. Those children were loved. I saw him read to them, play with them, talk with them. They were his brood, his heirs, his family. I was just an increase of his wealth. I knew they were my half-siblings, but I was never allowed to play with them, and they never played with me. But they were allowed to hit me if I was bad. Maybe because I was his, at least I didn't spend as much time out in the fields as the others. She clenched her little hands hard enough that she shook. Though rage or pain could have both accounted for it, the squeezed shut eyes denied Zess any chance to guess which it was. Maybe both? The half-elf wondered. Lucky me. I got to take care of the house. I picked up toys I wasn't allowed to play with, washed clothes I never got to wear, and followed his wife around as a servant when she had visitors. My father thought of me as an asset, but otherwise I was nothing, just a servant he got for free. He joked with his grandson that when he bought my mother and made me, it was two for the price of one. It always made them laugh. It made all of them laugh. I hoped I'd live to see the old man die, but somehow he's still around. My mother, he gave to his grandson, and I have a little brother now as a result. The old woman is still around too, and if her husband and his other children thought of me only as an asset, just a tool that works? She thought of me as proof of her husband's infidelity, and since she couldn't punish him, she punished me. And when her grandson's wife moved in and he made my mother carry a new servant, I can already see the hatred in the next generation. Going toward my baby brother. He'll live like me. The reason for Lila's tight-shut eyes was manifesting when little shimmering tears made their way out despite her effort at hiding them. I got sent out to the fields more often in the last year or two. Planting takes a lot of work. And the lash stings a lot. I'm too small to beat like they do men and women, but they have little paddles full of holes, and use that on the ones my size if we don't work fast enough. That was when I met Master Cerebrate. I was busy pulling weeds, and a stubborn one wouldn't come up. The overseer saw, said I was too slow, and he made me grab my ankles. And he rolled past while I was taking my licks. He bought me on the spot. I thought I was in hell, but that was just a nightmare. What Master Cerebrate did? That was hell. Please. Please don't make me talk about that. Layali finally ran out of steam. She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, and little choked sobs began to make their way past her pursed lips despite her best efforts. Layali, cover your ears, Brain said with more gentleness than she expected. She nodded a little bit and plugged her ears with her forefingers. Why'd you have her do that? Zess, she asked, looking down at the little half-elf and seeing the increasingly red face deepen. Because I saw all her injuries, and I doubt she'd want to hear them recounted. Brain explained. When I found her, I thought she was dead. The story did not improve from there as she listened. The litany of injuries, down to and including the intimate ones, left the heterochromatic half-elf stunned into silence. When it was over, Zesh's hands folded together in her lap and she looked down in shame. I didn't know. I really didn't know. How? Aren't you from this country? Brain asked when Layali went to sit beside him on the bed. He looked at Zeshi with his face drawn in disbelief, and the half-elf nodded. I am, but I don't get out much. Skills like mine make me humanity's trump card, so they put me in charge of the treasury and only bring me out. Only bring me out when they need me. Dead gods! She suddenly exclaimed, her head snapped up, startling the human and younger half-elf into nearly jumping out of their skin. What? The two cried and looked around for a threat that wasn't there. They knew. They all knew, Zeshi hissed, the Cardinals, the Pontifex Maximus. They all knew. Raymond knew. They kept all this from me, all this time. She balled up her fists tight enough to whiten her knuckles and gritted her teeth. I never really believed the whole chosen of the gods nonsense from the priests. Just let me kill my father and that'll be good enough. But I never thought. Zeshi glanced at the half-elven girl and recalled the empty socket where the newly restored eye shone brightly, and the look of abject terror on her little face when Zeshi entered the room. I thought I was coming to you for answers, human. No. Brain. But it looks like all I found were a lot more questions. Zeshi pinched the bridge of her nose and looked down at the floor. So you intend to go back? Brain asked. I don't like the sound of that. Raymond is the name of one of the cardinals. She talks about them all like she knows them. That would mean that Raymond is the Raymond, and if something she says gets her ire up towards. That train of thought did not need more baggage. Brain's mind flailed for a solution while he listened for her answer. I don't know. I think yes, I'm going to slap him till he talks. I want to know what else I don't know, but should. Zeshi frowned deeply, her foot tapped faster than grains of sand dropping through an hourglass. You could come with us. Brain jumped at the answer and did his best to ignore Layali's gawking. I'm a traveler, I know the way to where you're going. You can see things with your own eyes and not through some filter the cardinals want to force on you. Zeshi almost took a step back. Are you serious? I almost killed you. That's a Tuesday, to me. Brain laughed and tapped his hand over the hilt of his sword. Hardly something to hold a grudge over, and it was just a misunderstanding. Besides, I'm betting you don't have any money and know nothing about fieldcraft. If you don't want to eat garbage, steal, or make a bloody mess of yourself, and get lost 1,000 times a day, I'm your best option. Zeshi furrowed her black and white brow at him. What do you want? Brain shrugged. Promise to help look after this one until we drop her somewhere safe, give me some lessons, and take direction when it's time to lay camp. We'll call it even. I've got enough money to fund the three of us. Zeshi thought that over. The blue-haired swordsman wasn't wrong, far from it, but he made very unpleasant, very true points. I don't even know how to start a damn campfire. Fine, you win, Brain, we have a bargain. When do we leave? Zeshi asked and thrust out her hand for him to shake.